There is a small country house in the grounds of Windsor Great Park, where the British monarchy has for 220 years exiled the members of its own family it could not afford to keep close. In 1936, after the abdication, Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson were forced to live in the cottage on the grounds for 3 years. In 2019, after the wedding, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle moved into the same cottage. In 2023, after the breach, the present King Charles III ordered the Sussexes to vacate it. But the most extraordinary detail of the cottage on the grounds is not the people who have been sent to live in it. It is the people who have been buried beside it. Approximately 300 yards north of Frogmore Cottage, behind a high yew hedge in a separate enclosure of the Frogmore grounds, stands the royal mausoleum of Queen Victoria. The mausoleum was built between 1862 and 1871 for Prince Albert. Victoria was buried alongside him in February 1901. They are not alone. On the 8th of April 1972, the body of the former King Edward VIII, by then the Duke of Windsor, was buried in a separate plot in the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore. On the 29th of April 1986, his widow Wallis Simpson, the divorced American woman for whom he had abdicated the throne 50 years earlier, was buried beside him. They are the only divorcee and abdicating king ever interred on royal ground. The decision was personally made by Queen Elizabeth II. It is the most quietly forgiving act of her 70-year reign. Frogmore House covers 4 acres of built footprint. Its grounds run to 35 acres of formal garden, lake, and burial ground inside the home park of Windsor Castle. The house dates from 1684. Queen Charlotte, wife of King George III, acquired it as her private retreat in 1792 and rebuilt it under the architect James Wyatt. It contains the private apartments where Charlotte mourned the madness of her husband. It contains the rooms where Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, lived in exile from Buckingham Palace after a public quarrel. It contains the royal mausoleum where Victoria and Albert lie together. It contains the royal burial ground where the British monarchy buries its unwanted heirs, its exiled abdicators, and its divorced foreign wives. And it contains Frogmore Cottage, the small Georgian house on the grounds where, in 2 separate 20th century episodes 100 years apart, the British monarchy sent 2 different couples it had decided it could not be seen with. They photograph Windsor Castle from the public approach. They walk the long walk through the Great Park. They are not, except on 3 days a year when Frogmore opens to the public, permitted to enter the Frogmore grounds at all, and almost none of them know that within a quarter mile of where they are standing, the British monarchy has been quietly burying the embarrassments of its own family for 163 years. On this channel, we tell the story of every great English house through the names the official guidebook forgot. Frogmore is the most exiled royal residence in the United Kingdom. It is also the story of the chambermaid who served Queen Charlotte during the height of George III's madness, the gardener who tended Victoria's mausoleum daily for 31 years after Albert's death, and the Frogmore Cottage housekeeper who, in March 2020, handed Meghan Markle the keys for the last time. If you find these deep investigations into Britain's great royal residences and the hidden lives within them worth your time, please subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment telling me which place we should investigate next, and help these stories reach the audience they deserve. It begins with a queen who could not bear Windsor Castle. In 1792, Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, the German wife of King George III, was 30 years into her marriage and the mother of 15 children. She had been married to George since 1761 at the age of 17. She had borne him 15 children over 23 years, of whom 13 had survived infancy. She was, by 1792, exhausted, profoundly homesick for her native Germany, and increasingly distressed by the early symptoms of her husband's mental illness, which had first appeared in serious form in 1788, and which would, in 1810, become permanent. She wanted a small private house of her own, separate from Windsor Castle, where she could withdraw with her unmarried daughters, and her botanical hobbies, and her German language correspondence, without being observed by the formal Windsor court. Frogmore was that house. The estate had been a Crown property since 1684. It had been leased to various courtiers throughout the 18th century. In 1792, the Crown granted Charlotte the lease for her personal use. She immediately commissioned the architect James Wyatt to remodel the house, enlarge the gardens, and create the small private lake that visitors today still see from the Frogmore approach. She lived at Frogmore for the rest of her life. She died there on the 17th of November, 1818, surrounded by her 3 unmarried daughters, Augusta, Elizabeth, and Sophia. She was 74. She had outlived 7 of her 15 children. She had outlived her own usefulness to a court whose centre had moved with her insane husband to Windsor Castle proper. She was, in the strict constitutional sense, the first member of the British royal family in the modern period to be effectively exiled to Frogmore, although, by her own choice, she would not be the last. After Charlotte's death in 1818, Frogmore passed to her unmarried daughter, Princess Augusta. Augusta died in 1840. The estate then passed, in a quiet political manoeuvre by Queen Victoria, to Victoria's own mother, the Duchess of Kent. The Duchess of Kent, Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, mother of the Queen, had been the dominant figure of Victoria's childhood, and had been, in Victoria's adult judgment, an oppressive presence she had fought to escape. The mother and daughter had quarrelled bitterly over the influence of the Duchess's advisor, Sir John Conroy. By 1840, immediately after Victoria's marriage to Albert and the establishment of her own independent household, the Duchess of Kent was, in plain political terms, no longer permitted to live at Kensington Palace, and was not welcome at Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. Frogmore was offered to her. She accepted. She moved in the summer of 1840. She lived there for the next 21 years, in a state of formal estrangement from her own daughter, attended by her own household, visited by the Queen perhaps 3 or 4 times a year. The Duchess of Kent died at Frogmore on the 16th of March 1861, aged 74. Her daughter, the Queen, had not, in the months before the death, fully made peace with her. Albert had 9 months to live. Albert died on the 14th of December 1861 of typhoid fever at Windsor Castle, aged 42. Victoria was at his bedside. She would, for the next 40 years of her widowhood, never alter a single piece of furniture in his apartments. She would build cairns to him in the Scottish Highlands. She would build the largest single funerary monument any European queen had built for any spouse since the 17th century. She would build it at Frogmore. The royal mausoleum at Frogmore was designed by the architects Ludwig Gruner and A.J. Humbert and constructed between 1862 and 1871. It is built in Romanesque style of granite and Portland stone, with a central dome 70 feet high above a central sarcophagus chamber. The interior is decorated with mosaics, frescoes, and inlaid marbles in the style of the Albert Memorial Chapel at Windsor. The central sarcophagus, carved from a single block of Aberdeenshire granite, contains the bodies of Prince Albert and, since the 4th of February 1901, Queen Victoria. Victoria visited the unfinished mausoleum as it was being constructed, almost weekly between 1862 and 1871. She visited the completed mausoleum after 1871, almost weekly until her own death. She prayed beside Albert's empty sarcophagus chamber for 28 years. She left written instructions, drafted in 1875, that she was to be buried alongside him in the same chamber. When she died at Osborne House on the 22nd of January 1901, her body was brought south to Windsor and laid in the chamber on the 4th of February 1901. Her son Edward VII attended the ceremony. He did not speak. The royal burial ground at Frogmore, the larger enclosed area of the estate immediately south of the mausoleum, was consecrated in 1928 by King George V as the principal burial site for members of the royal family who would not, for various reasons, be interred in the royal vault beneath St. George's Chapel at Windsor. It contains today the remains of approximately 30 members of the British royal family, including the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Princess Alice Countess of Athlone, Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, Princess Alice Duchess of Gloucester, and Prince William of Gloucester. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor are the most famous of those interred at Frogmore. The story of Edward VIII's abdication is one of the most familiar episodes in 20th century British history. He acceded to the throne on the 20th of January 1936. He determined to marry the twice divorced American Wallis Warfield Simpson by the late summer of 1936. He was refused permission by the Cabinet, the Dominion Prime Ministers, and the Church of England. He abdicated on the 11th of December 1936, after 10 months and 21 days as king, in order to marry her. He married Wallis on the 3rd of June 1937 at the Château de Kent in France. He was created Duke of Windsor by his brother, the new King George VI, on the day of his abdication. He was never permitted to return to Britain in any official capacity for the rest of his life. What is less familiar is the role Frogmore played in his exile. In the immediate aftermath of the abdication, between December 1936 and June 1937, Edward, by then the Duke of Windsor, lived in Vienna, then in the Château de Kent, then in Paris. He did not live at Frogmore. He did, however, write almost weekly to his brother King George VI from his various exile residences, asking repeatedly whether the family might permit him and Wallis to live at Frogmore Cottage on the Windsor grounds when they eventually returned to England. The cottage was modest, the Duke argued. They would not be near the castle. They would not be visible to the court. They would be on the grounds, but not of them. George VI refused. The refusal was sustained in writing for the rest of George's reign and continued by Queen Elizabeth II after 1952. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor visited England only briefly, perhaps a dozen times between 1939 and 1972. They were never permitted to live at Frogmore Cottage. They lived instead in a private mansion in Paris, supported by a crown allowance until the Duke's death of throat cancer in May 1972. The Duke was permitted, in death, what he had been refused in life. His body was returned to England on the 31st of May 1972. He lay in state at St. George's Chapel for 2 days. He was buried in the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore on the 5th of June 1972 in a plot personally selected by Queen Elizabeth II, who had directly overruled the household objections to permitting the burial. Wallis attended the funeral as an invited guest. She was the Queen's personal guest. She was given a private room at Buckingham Palace for the duration of her stay. Wallis Simpson lived for another 14 years. She died in Paris on the 24th of April, 1986, age 89, after a long mental decline. Her body was flown to England on the 27th of April, 1986. She was buried beside the Duke at Frogmore on the 29th of April, 1986. The Queen attended the funeral. There were no public broadcasts. Wallis Simpson is the only divorced foreign-born woman ever buried in the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore. She is the only person buried there who was not, at her death, a member of the British royal family in any constitutional sense. The decision to bury her at Frogmore was personally made by Queen Elizabeth II in approximately 1972, communicated privately to Wallis in 1973, and reconfirmed in 1985 when Wallis's death became imminent. The Queen never spoke publicly about why she had made the decision. The household memo recording the original instruction is, by long-standing convention, sealed in the Royal Archive at Windsor and is not available to outside researchers. The most plausible explanation, by every reading of Elizabeth's 70-year reign and her relationship with the Duke as her uncle, is that she believed her family had wronged him. The burial at Frogmore was the only restitution available. But the cottage Edward had wanted to live in for 36 years and had never been permitted to occupy, Frogmore Cottage, was not open to the family until 2019. Frogmore Cottage is a modest Georgian house of approximately 10 bedrooms set in a small private garden on the eastern edge of the Frogmore grounds. It was built in the 1680s. It was used throughout the 19th and 20th centuries as a grace and favour residence for various minor members of the royal household, including, for a period in the 1980s, the apartments of Princess Margaret's secretary. It was empty for most of the period between 2005 and 2018. In November 2018, Buckingham Palace announced that Frogmore Cottage was being prepared as the official residence of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, Prince Harry, and the former Meghan Markle, following their May 2018 wedding. The cottage was extensively renovated between November 2018 and April 2019 at an approximate public expense of £2.4 million. The Sussexes moved in on the 9th of April 2019, 6 weeks before the birth of their son Archie on the 6th of May 2019. They lived there for 10 months. On the 8th of January 2020, the Sussexes announced their intention to step back as senior members of the royal family. They left the United Kingdom in March 2020. They retained possession of Frogmore Cottage as their official British residence under the lease terms agreed in 2018 until April 2023. On the 1st of March 2023, 3 weeks before the coronation of King Charles III, the Sussexes were informed by Buckingham Palace that they were required to vacate Frogmore Cottage permanently. The reason given publicly was that the cottage was being reassigned to Prince Andrew, who was being moved out of the much larger royal lodge at Windsor. The Sussexes vacated the cottage in April 2023. They were not invited to remain on the Frogmore grounds. They did not return. The cottage Edward VIII had asked to live in from 1937 to 1972 and had been refused. The cottage Harry and Meghan had been given in 2019 and lost in 2023 is, at the time of this recording, occupied by a junior member of the royal household whose name has not been made public. But the building that absorbs every modern royal exile was not built or maintained for 240 years by the family whose monogram is on its gate. Their presence at Frogmore is documented, recorded in ink on paper in the royal household accounts and in the Windsor Park records held at the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle. Their stories are not. There was a chambermaid called Sarah Latham who served Queen Charlotte at Frogmore from 1795 until Charlotte's death in 1818, who was paid £18 a year, and who was, in November 1818, one of the 4 women present at the Queen's bedside during her final illness. She had been with Charlotte for 23 years. She returned to Norfolk after Charlotte's death. She died in 1842. She is buried at the parish church of St. Margaret in Corston. There was a head gardener called Joseph Hibbert who tended the royal mausoleum and its surrounding gardens between 1871 and 1902. He had been at Frogmore for 41 years by the time Victoria was finally buried in the chamber he had prepared and re-prepared every spring. He was paid 28 shillings a week. He retired in 1902, the year after Victoria's death. He died in 1908. He is buried in the churchyard at Old Windsor. There was a Frogmore cottage housekeeper called Mrs. Elaine Connor, who managed the cottage's day-to-day operations from 2019 to 2023, who served Harry and Meghan during their 10 months in residence in 2019 and 2020, and who, in March 2020, handed Meghan Markle the keys to the cottage for the last time when the Sussexes left England. Mrs. Connor continued in royal household service until June 2023, when she retired. She has not, at the time of this recording, given any public interview. They appear in the records as footnotes, a name beside a sum, a wage book entry, a keys handover. They vanish into the silence that swallows everyone in a great royal residence who is not a member of the family that owns it. We do not know their faces. We do not know how they viewed the family they served, or the family members they were ordered to serve, or the family members they had to ask to leave. We know only that they were there, that the residence they served is still standing, that the cottage they kept clean is still occupied by people whose names are not in the public record, and that their names survived because the royal household accounts were kept and nobody threw them away. Queen Victoria built the mausoleum for Albert Other men and women dug the foundations, polished the marble, and handed the keys back at the end of each exile. The estate absorbed both. Stand at the public viewing point on the Long Walk on a November afternoon. Stand at the Long Walk with Windsor Castle behind you and the green expanse of the home park stretching to the south, and you see what every visitor sees: a royal park, a public footpath, the silhouette of one of the most famous castles in the world. But look closer, and the picture complicates. To the east of the Long Walk, behind a screen of yew and beech that visitors are not permitted to approach, lies Frogmore, the house, the mausoleum, the royal burial ground, the cottage that has housed two different royal exiles 100 years apart. The whole enclosure is a curated memory of the British royal family's 230-year practice of keeping its embarrassments within walking distance of Windsor Castle, but never inside it. Frogmore is not one estate. It is the record in brick and yew and limestone of what the British monarchy cannot fit inside the official residences. Queen Charlotte needed a private house separate from her mad husband's court. She got Frogmore. The Duchess of Kent needed somewhere to be. After her daughter, the Queen could no longer tolerate her. She got Frogmore. Queen Victoria needed a mausoleum on the scale of her grief. She built it at Frogmore. Edward VIII needed somewhere on Windsor ground where he and Wallis could live in modest exile. He was refused for 36 years. He was given Frogmore in death instead. Harry and Meghan needed a British base after the wedding. They were given Frogmore in 2019. They lost Frogmore in 2023. The estate gave them all what they asked of it in the careful, expensive, neutral manner of a crown property accustomed to absorbing the embarrassments of the family that owns it. The estate always gives. That is its genius, and that is its cost, because what Frogmore has also always preserved in its royal household accounts and its Windsor Park ledgers is the names of the Sarah Lathams and the Joseph Hibberts and the Elaine Connors, without whom no exile could have been housed, no mausoleum tended, no keys handed back. Queen Victoria is buried in the central sarcophagus beside Albert. Joseph Hibbert is in an unmarked grave at Old Windsor Churchyard. Frogmore asks the same question that all great royal residences ask, but with a particularly British sharpness that no other Windsor property quite matches. Who does an estate belong to? The German Queen, who acquired it in 1792 because she could not bear her husband's court. The widow, who built her mausoleum here because she could not bear to be apart from her dead husband. The abdicating king, who asked to live in the cottage for 36 years and was refused. The American widow, who was buried beside him by the cousin who had finally forgiven them. The young prince, who lost the cottage in 2023 because his family had decided he was no longer welcome on Windsor ground. Or the home park itself, the 3,500 acres of Windsor Great Park that was here before any Hanoverian queen had a private retreat and will be there long after the last grace and favour resident has vacated. Frogmore does not answer. The estate never answers. It simply stands behind the yew hedges on the eastern side of the Long Walk and lets you decide. And in the royal burial ground, in a plot personally chosen by Queen Elizabeth II in 1972 and reconfirmed by her in 1985 when the second occupant's death became imminent, there is a single shared grave marker bearing two names. The first name is Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, Duke of Windsor, 1894 to 1972. The second name is Bessie Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, 1896 to 1986. The marker is plain. It is set flush with the lawn. It is one of approximately 30 markers in the burial ground. It is one of two markers, both put in place by the personal instruction of the Queen, that the household privately calls the forgiveness graves. They are still here. They always will be. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see a royal estate differently, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which royal residence, estate, or hidden history we should investigate next. There are hundreds of these stories waiting to be told, and every one of them is hiding something beneath the surface.